name is Will Marshall. I'm president of the Progressive Policy Institute. And I want to welcome you to today's PPI webinar on the subject of a transatlantic response to the China challenge. President Biden, as everyone knows, just made his first visit to Europe last month. And he stressed there that the liberal democracies, Europe and the United States, are locked in a competition of systems with the autocratic powers of the world, but particularly with China. And he made a very strong case that for stronger transatlantic unity in meeting the multifaceted China challenge. That includes the crackdown on freedoms in Hong Kong, the brutal ethnic cleansing of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, China's predatory trade practices, including incessant cyber espionage and technology theft, the militarization of the seas surrounding China, and a kind of coercive diplomacy, a diplomacy of intimidation that's clearly intended to silence foreign critics of China. Now, I don't think that we in Europe and the United States really relish a new Cold War with China, but neither can we revert to the old policy of accommodating the peaceful rise of China that began in the 1990s. That policy sadly has failed to really liberalize China, as many of us who had hoped at the time. And in fact, the opposite has occurred under Xi Jinping. We've seen a backsliding to totalitarian rule in China, a kind of bristling nationalism at home, which we just heard in his speech on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, and a more aggressive, assertive stance abroad. So President Biden is saying that the new policy ought to be one of strategic competition for political and economic leadership in the world. And I think he sees an opportunity to take advantage of the growing skepticism in Europe about China's intentions to revive the old habits of transatlantic cooperation that atrophied under Donald Trump. We're very fortunate today to be joined by three distinguished elected leaders from Europe and the United States to discuss the prospects for rebuilding transatlantic solidarity. So without further ado, let me introduce them and we'll get right into our conversation. First is my longtime friend, Reinhard Bütikofer. Reinhard is a member of the European Parliament from the German Green Party. He's a former head of that party. And he's also co-chairman of the European Green Party as well. Most relevant, perhaps for today's purposes, is that Reinhard chairs the European Parliament delegation for relations with China. And that capacity has really been warning about the divide and conquer diplomacy toward Europe that we've seen from Beijing. And for his troubles, he's been kind of designated, maybe unofficially, as a number one on China's sanction list, as I think about Europeans to try to punish. Congressman Gerry Connolly represents is in a seventh term, representing Virginia's 11th district, is my neighbor, one district over. He has an extensive background as one of the key Democratic spokespersons for foreign policy, sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and is co-chairman of the Congressional Caucus on Taiwan, which we'll want to talk about. He's also the president of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Parliamentary Assembly. U.S. Representative Bera represents California's 7th district since 2013. He's the longest serving Indian American in Congress. He's also on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, serving on the subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and non-proliferation. I mean, that's a lot of territory to cover, Congressman. And he is also a doctor, and that's made him one of the leading, in his previous life, and that's made him one of the leading spokespersons on health policy in the Democratic Party. Both Gerry Connolly and Bera are key figures in the House New Democratic Coalition, which is the home of the pragmatic wing of the Democratic Party. So let me kick things off with you, Reinhard, please. How was President Biden's message received in the European Union, in the Parliament where you sit, but also in some of the key capitals of Europe? And how does Europe assess the dangers coming from China? Do they agree with Biden, or are there reservations about the course that he was proposing?
Well, Thank you, first of all, Will, for having me. It's always great to be back at PPI, and I cherish being here for this conversation with the representatives and your audience. And I would just straightforwardly say uh, President Biden's visit to Europe, where he had the densest, weakest symmetry that I can remember. First with the G7, then with NATO, then with the EU. That was a great strategic success. Obviously, China had tried to drive a wedge between the European Union and the US by just 3 weeks before Biden came into office, uh, finalizing the so-called Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, where they were aided in particular by the Chancellor Merkel, and who's, by the way, just today visiting Washington, and President Macron of France. We in the European Parliament were extremely critical of that deal because it really doesn't address most of the issues that our industry has. It doesn't really create a level playing field. It doesn't create the kind of economic reciprocity that we would want to see, and it doesn't address the atrocious policies that China pursues, in particular in Xinjiang, where they oppress the Uyghur minority in a very atrocious way. Um, Biden was welcomed because he signaled that not only was the U.S. back in the business of uh, working with allies, which was an extremely important message, but also because he struck a tone that coincided somewhat, considerably, I would say, with the kind of analysis that we had made around Europe of where we stand with China. We say we are a competitor. We also look for cooperation, but um, we are at any rate systemic rivals. And that systemic rivalry has two main dimensions. On one hand, it's the rivalry between democracy and authoritarianism. And I would say the kind of governance system that Xi Jinping has erected in Xinjiang that should be called techno-totalitarianism. And on the other hand, it's also a rivalry between a rules-based multilateral order and a China-centric system of global governance. And in that regard, um, it is indeed, and this is widely shared around Europe, it is indeed a high priority that transatlantic partners get our act together. I would frankly say neither one, not the US and certainly not Europe, if we just go on our own, can rest assured that we will master the Chinese challenge. Because this is a very impressive foe. And if you cherish the same values and if you have a great overlap in important strategic interests, you should cooperate. And that was what Biden signaled and what was welcomed around Europe. And I should add that the overall perception of China around Europe is not all that different from what it is in the United States. In most European countries, including my own, Germany, the skepticism towards the uh, governing system in China is very dire. Um, this is shared by wide parts of the society, including many actors in the business community. It should be noted that the German Federation of Industry, BDI, was one of the first European organizations that really struck a very critical tone vis-a-vis China already more than 2 years ago. So this is not a development where you have the human rights freaks on one side and business on the other, and there's a trade-off. We're learning, the business community and the human rights people and also the national security crowd, we're all learning that there is this systemic challenge from China, and that we have to pull together whatever we can in order to master that challenge. And in that regard, I really think it was very good that the president came and that he shared that message.
Well, thanks, Reinhard. That's good to hear. Let me turn to Gerry Connolly and Bera for the reaction in Congress, and not just your own reactions, but you might give us a feel for how Democrats and Republicans are reacting to Biden's emphasis on this new strategic competition with China.
Well, there's so many dimensions of this. First of all, I certainly echo much of what Reinhard said. I think from certainly in Congress, I would say China is almost friendless. There aren't a lot of enthusiasts about the People's Republic of China in Congress championing their cause, or even saying, well, wait a minute, look at the other side here. And so I think there was bipartisan support for Trump's willingness to call out China, not necessarily how he did it. In fact, most certainly not how he did it. But the fact that finally a United States president called out China for its malign behavior, its intellectual property theft, its predatory practices, and on, I think was long overdue. And I think we all welcome President Biden borrowing in and engaging our allies in that discussion. And let me give you an example of why that's long overdue. So here is a country that is scheduled to become the world's largest GDP in the next 3 or 4 years. It has the world's largest military, the world's largest Navy. It now has a Belt and Road Initiative that has touched 138 countries, representing 61% of the world's population and well over 40% of the world's global GDP. And yet, not until 4 years ago did a NATO document even mention China. Mention it, let alone identify who it was, what the threat or challenge was. And you hear sort of the equivocators say we don't want to go into a Cold War with China. Well, of course we don't want to go back to a Cold War with anybody. However, we've got to be clear-eyed about this relationship and the threat Xi poses. Under Deng Xiaoping, they had a policy of hide and buy. Continue to grow, attract investments, do it quietly, with the glaring tragic exception of Tiananmen Square. He pretty much did that. And so Chinese behavior was not alarming anybody. Xi Jinping has completely junked that policy. In fact, show it all, make sure everybody understands you're aggressive and you're going to use every tool at your disposal to propagate your values, your authoritarian system, and to try to influence others in overt and covert ways. And they represent a direct challenge to Western liberal democratic values and societies. And their influence is far beyond the South China Sea. I mean, they're in the Arctic, they're in the South Mediterranean, they're in the Caucasus. I mean, they most certainly have expanded into the neighborhood of NATO and its alliance. And so we've got to meet this challenge. Hopefully it's going to be a peaceful competition, but it's got to be a competition. But we also cannot be into denial or magical thinking about who and what Xi Jinping is and the challenge, fundamental challenge it represents for our economies, but more importantly, the very societies we represent.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, thank you. But I want to ask Ami, Bera, do you think that Democrats are united behind the kind of stance that Congress laid out, or and where do the Republicans fit on this? So one of the things that Biden proposed that was accepted, I guess, by Europe was that we have our own counter, a European and American counter to the Belt and Road Initiative. Big infrastructure investments in the developing world, particularly in Africa, to counter China. Is that something that this Congress would actually support, do you think?
And well, thanks for having me on. It's my honor to be on with Reinhard and my good friend Gerry Connolly. I actually, I agree with everything that both Reinhard and Gerry said. And on this issue of building a better world, that they talked about at the G7, plus the other leading democracies. I do think there's a coalition coming together, and I think the Biden strategy of rebuilding these coalitions and multilateralism that really was the exact opposite of what Donald Trump did in terms of blowing up some of these partnerships and alliances really is the right strategy. Certainly in the region that I chair, Asia and the Pacific, on the subcommittee, we really are trying to work together as not just a Democratic strategy or Republican strategy, but what's an American strategy as we look at this great power competition. And I don't characterize it as the Cold War necessarily, because the Soviet Union was a different type of adversary. But this is a competition of ideas. As Gerry pointed out, the values that we share with our European counterparts, but also the values that we share with the mature democracies in Asia. So I actually think that in this case, Democrats and Republicans are pretty much on the same page. I mean, take out some of our domestic politics and so forth, but when we're looking at the rest of the world, and particularly with eyes on China, I think we are trying to craft a strategy. And you saw it in the Senate being able to come together to put together a big bill and get that passed in a bipartisan way. Gerry and I will be sitting in a big markup this afternoon. That may go on for a number of hours, but we're also putting together our package and our approach to China. And I just don't know that you would have seen that 4 years ago. But I clearly expect that we will pass something out of the House. We'll take the Senate bill. That'll go to conference, and that we will come together as Democrats and Republicans with the package that is a statement not of either party, but how we as America want to approach this power competition. But I do think President Biden's trip to the G7, his overtures to NATO have been very well received in Congress, and clearly the right things to do. I think the 2x2s that they've done with Japan and Korea, the overtures, elevating the Quad to the leaders level. And it's my hope that we're now able to take the transatlantic partnership and an Indo-Pacific, Trans-Pacific partnership and bring those coalitions together. Because I would argue that's the thing that China fears the most, is if these like-minded allies, like countries that share values of democracy, of human rights, of free markets, of a rules-based order of movement of goods and services, if we're able to pull that off and come together, then we're setting the rules of the road here. And I would just add one last thing on the Build Back Better world. I do think you will see countries coming together to leverage our aid and development resources. I think you're seeing it happen around vaccine diplomacy. Obviously, vaccines are the currency of the day. And as Europe gets to, critical mass of vaccinations, as we get to critical mass of vaccinations, I think we can work together to, obviously go to the rest of the world and help, show that not just America's back, but these democratic coalitions, these like valued countries are back, and we're at the playing field.
Will, if I could just add to
Thank you.
Will, if I could just
Sure.
add one more dimension here, I do believe that this growing rivalry and threat, rivalry with and threat from China, is also going to rearrange relationships in other parts of the world. In addition to hopefully galvanizing our alliance, the North Atlantic Alliance, look at the relationship. I think it's going to create problems in the Pakistan relationship with the United States, but I think it's also going to drive India and the United States closer together than ever because of the sense of mutual threat, which is already proved kinetic. You know, that's not a theoretical threat, that's an actual military threat.
Right.
And I think you're going to see that pattern repeated, even with old adversaries like Vietnam. You know, they're going to find common cause with the United States because of that threat from the North and China. So China's aggression is going to have negative repercussions in many relationships for China too.
And Will, if I could just add on.
Thank you. And
Will, if I could just add on to Gerry,
please.
We've seen it in Australia as well, right? I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said Australia taking a very laissez-faire approach to China. China's ham-handed, you know, reaction to, you know, very minor issues with Australia really has pushed Australia into our direction as well. And I'd say that Australia-Sino relationship is at an all-time low as well.
Yes, really bad relations. Thank you. Let me. I want to come back to some of these questions you raised, in particularly the Pacific picture. But let me go back to Reinhard. And Reinhard, you had talked about it's really a diplomatic spat between the European Union and China over what's happening to the Uyghurs. You know, the European Parliament labeled that crimes against humanity. China reacted furiously, and we've seen a round of sanctions from Europe and sanctions from China on European leaders, and the suspension of the investment agreement, which was a source of consternation in the United States, as right as Joe Biden was coming in office. Europe was concluding that agreement with China. Is this a turning point? How significant is the suspension of this deal? Is it just on hold until everything returns to normal, or are the European nations also rethinking their deep trade ties to China? Because, you know, Germany, your country, I think China's Germany's biggest trading partner, and, you know, up to now has been a little bit reticent on some of these issues. So what do you think? How serious and far-reaching is this spat?
I would say, well, that the rethinking started about 5 years ago, and it started to a considerable degree from the economic side of things, because German engineers were realizing that the economic relationship was changing. For so many years, we had indeed a kind of a win-win relationship where we provided the high-tech products and the luxury cars that they craved, and they provided us with cheap commodities. That wasn't even a competition. So that was a very easy deal. But China started to move up through the value chains and became a competitor. And under these new changing circumstances, the fact that they don't play by the rules became more important in defending our own back. So clearly, the Made in China 2025 strategy, which was frankly a nationalist economic strategy, that had many people thinking twice. And so the transformation has been going on for a while. And in 2016, for instance, we passed in the European Parliament a new anti-dumping regulation. And then we had an investment screening mechanism for the first time ever, came into force last year. Today, we're talking about other defensive instruments to try to force more of a level playing field in the economic arena. And there are still a couple of multinational corporations like Volkswagen that have put so many eggs into this one Chinese basket that they don't dare saying a critical word. But when you listen to other voices from the business community, you hear a different language. And that is a process that is simultaneously taking place in many European countries. And there have been a few leaders that have been reluctant, as you say, and the chancellor would have been one of them, probably the most important one of them. But when you look at the electoral platforms of the major German parties in the run-up to the September national elections, you will find that in all the platforms, there is more critical language than you would have heard from the outgoing government. So even if you go to the chancellor's party, uh, they are putting down a policy that she has never pursued. So I think there is a transformative process going on. Of course, the issue will be, will we find enough European coherence? Will we work together? And will we find enough transatlantic coherence? And of course, that has to be fostered from all sides participating in the effort.
Okay. Thank you, Reinhard. Let me ask Gerry and Ami this. Do we need some kind of new forum, U.S. European forum, to discuss cooperation on policy toward China? That happens at your level, at the legislative level, but that is ongoing, so that we can really talk about the priorities of around which we cooperate and make this a centerpiece of the relationship. And if you think we should do that, I'd be interested in your thoughts and whether Congress would support it. But also, what do you think are our main sources of leverage, when it comes to dealing with China? What can we do that might affect their calculus and maybe get them to rethink what is a very assertive attempt to impose their model on the world?
With respect to the first question, Will, I'm agnostic about that. I guess I'd like to see us use it's not mutually exclusive, but let's start by using the existing forums we've got to focus on this subject, because they have been really slow to come to the table on this subject. So we've got to reinvigorate this discussion in NATO. We've got to reinvigorate it with our European allies through the EU and multilateral mechanisms. And picking up on what Reinhard said, I will say I think the Europeans were slow to the game. And it was only after they saw some threats, and we pressed them on some threats like 5G and Huawei, but they also saw a whole new Chinese aggression. Hong Kong's a great example, but their genocidal activities with respect to the Uyghurs is another. Their willingness to actually get into kinetic activity on the Indian border, their encroachment in the South China Sea in the most aggressive way, right? Actually building man-made islands in order to then claim territorial waters, which encroach on the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Japan, Indonesia. These are very threatening kinds of moves. And also seeing the sort of malign predatory financing mechanisms they're using to entrap developing countries, like Sri Lanka maybe is the most dramatic example, that also then have strategic consequences, because now they have control over the port of Hambantota in the southern part of Sri Lanka, by which a third of all world shipping passes. What could go wrong with that? And they're right there in the Indian sphere of influence, or what ought to be. So, I also do think the pandemic has helped us understand more we allowed things to creep. in the name of trade and investment is good. And the more economic ties we have with each other, the more interdependence, the more we keep a check on malign behavior. Well, during the pandemic, we discovered that there were supply chains, critical supply chains, like PPE, like medical and antibiotic drug chains, in which we were over 80% reliant on one source, China. And even if China didn't want to play games with those supplies, since the pandemic began in China, they had to husband those resources. So we learned some vulnerabilities in the world economy that all of a sudden became stark. And I think that created a new commonality with friends and allies and other trading partners that have to be addressed, How, and final point, your question, how do we sort of respond? Well, certainly we can and will, and the Europeans will too, I believe, lessen our reliance on Chinese supplies. We are going to create new supply chains that are much more diverse and no longer reliant on a sole provider overwhelmingly. That's number one. I think you're starting to see, Reinhard mentioned VW, they're so far in, it's hard for them to ever even contemplate getting out. And they have to be careful about the terms of reference of staying in. But there are other investments that I think are really reassessing the cost of investing in China and maybe looking at the alternatives for reinvesting either back home or at some other location where the political costs are not as high or the intellectual property theft risks aren't as high. And so I think you're seeing that kind of reassessment as well. But I also think some of what China is doing is going to create a backlash for itself. Even the One Belt, One Road initiative, shoddy workmanship, overwhelming financing at the end of the game that has consequences, using Chinese labor and not local labor, creating huge resentments. I don't know that the One Belt, One Road thing is going to be an unparalleled success for them. And I also think it's waking up both Europe and the United States to this threat, and we're going to respond to it. And so I think Xi, in his glorious reemergence of China as a world power, has in some ways overplayed his hands and to our advantage. And the question now is, will we be able to take advantage of that to our benefit and to rein them in?
Let me go ahead and play off of Gerry for a second. I agree with them in terms of, I don't think we create a new multilateral organization. I think we start with the existing framework that's in place. And I think it was very important that you saw the G7 expand to, invite, 4 other well-developed democracies, in this case, in having India and Korea there, I think mattered to both those countries. But I think working off an alliance there, to have the communique that came out of that specifically mentioned China, I don't think that was unintentional. I think that was very key and strategic. So I think you can build off of some of those partnerships. And again, I mentioned the Quad in Asia, elevating that to the leaders level, I think was very important. I was just in Korea last week, and I don't know if it's Quad +1 bringing Korea in, but I can certainly see using that as a platform to bring some of the EU nations into coalitions on maritime security, freedom of navigation. You're seeing more frequent rotations of European navies going through the South China Sea in conjunction with the US Navy. All of those are important. They're not new coalitions. They're taking advantage of existing frameworks and joint exercises. I think that's all very important. The goal is to avoid a direct kinetic confrontation with China. I mean, that's not what this is about. It is a strategic competition, and you'll hear President Biden use the term values a lot. Gerry's used the term values. I use the term values, and I think we're creating a coalition of like valued countries that, respect competition's fine, but what are those rules of that competition? And we don't have to guess what Xi Jinping's agenda is, because he just put it out there in his 100th anniversary. It is not transparent how they're looking at the world right now. We don't have to guess at that. And my biggest worry is I do think we will continue to come together as like valued countries and like valued people, because China is almost accelerating that based on their actions and how heavy-handed they've responded to things. What I worry about is, as China becomes increasingly isolated, what direction do they go, right? I've not seen it in Xi Jinping that he's able to say, wait a minute, maybe let's backstep a little bit on what's happening in Xinjiang. Maybe let's, rethink some of the, like I have yet to see any sense of humility coming out of this Chinese premier. And the danger is, like, who are China's real allies? North Korea and Russia. And at the end of the day, Russia is more European than they are Chinese. And while they're playing this game of getting closer to China, I think at the end of the day, there'll always be some distance between Russia and China. So, North Korea is a nation with a lot of saber rattling, but really very little tools. China, I don't want China to become an isolated hermit kingdom with a lot of tools and a lot of ability to disrupt. So I think a seminal question for us is, how do we create a scenario where China can walk back a little bit and be a player at the table? But I think we have to do that from a place of strength, not a place of weakness.
Thanks. So you both stressed, NATO.
Well, let me come in here a little bit, because I would like to push back a little bit against this idea that China was somehow isolated. I think that's just not realistic. China is not isolated. If they were, we shouldn't worry all that much. But for every 2 countries that we find that would support our statements in the United Nations Human Rights Council, they find 4 that support their stance on the Uyghurs. And look at what different countries are saying about Xinjiang. They're not isolated. We shouldn't fool ourselves. I do agree with what Gerry said, that we don't need new formal organizations, but we need to talk a lot more. And I'm happy to say, to be able to say that we do that. So we have created a new transatlantic dialogue on China, and Wendy Sherman visited Brussels just a few weeks ago for the first formal meeting in that context. And we also have cooperation and collaboration and discussions between members of the European Parliament, members of national parliaments, and members of Congress in the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. So there is a lot to be discussed. And just yesterday, the Aspen Institute, together with the Munich Security Conference and the German think tank MERIX, published a strategy paper on transatlantic cooperation on China, and that listed quite a few urgent issues that we should tackle. And if we want to do that, we have to do it in the right spirit. And there I want to contradict Gerry a little bit. Gerry said, oh, we pressed the Europeans on 5G and then they moved. Well, that attitude is not conducive to a good collaboration. We're not pushing back against 5G inclusion of Huawei because we want to do the US a favor. I was probably one of the first European legislators who clearly signed an alarm over Huawei and 5G. But we didn't do that to do the US a favor, because we wanted to defend our own ass, because we wanted to defend our own national security interests. And I think it has to be understood in Washington that this is not the old pre-Trump, pre-Obama kind of relationship. I would borrow a phrase from President George Herbert Walker Bush, who 30 years ago said, we should build a partnership in leadership. This is what we need to do. I don't think it will be helpful around Europe. And I think just because I want to have this cooperation, I have to emphasize this. Being told by Washington what to do is not helping building an alliance vis-a-vis China. So let's be partners and act as partners.
You know, I would like to respond. First of all, I think Reinhard mischaracterized what I said. What I said was that I felt the Europeans might have been a little late to the game in understanding some of the threats from China, like Huawei and 5G. And I stand by that. I was at the Munich Security Conference a few years ago where we were still trying to persuade European allies as to the nature of the threat. And it was, by the way, one of those allies was Great Britain, which had already proceeded down the road pretty far in working with Huawei, and the United States had to, really work hard with them. But nobody was saying you need to do what we tell you. But I do think the United States gets to engage, gets to share its opinion, gets to try to urge and encourage and exhort allies from our perspective to recognize the threat and respond to it. That doesn't mean that at times the Europeans see the threat before us. I mean, God knows in the last 4 years, thank God, there were governments like yours, Reinhard, who held the torch when ours was very wobbly. And I certainly agree with you, this is not a time for the United States to be dictating or patronizing. But I also think you would recognize that, I'm looking at it from a NATO perspective with 30 nations. And I look at some of our friends who are pretty squishy on some of these subjects. And that's why I think we do need a dialogue, but we also need to have a lot of clarity about the nature of the threat and some of the prescriptions for responding to it. Thank you.
And Will, if I could,
can I just say that? Yeah.
It's not that I think China is an isolation right now. It clearly isn't. It's clearly active in international organizations. And as Gerry alluded, the last 4 years, the fact that the United States was not even sitting at the table engaging in these conversations was a bad idea. It is, though, that I can see a scenario where as we build these coalitions, as we come together, had you asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said we would have passed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we would have concluded a transatlantic trading relationship, and we would be spending our time right now bringing those two agreements together to create a framework of movement of goods, services, and so forth in the 21st century. That wasn't predicated as a Chinese strategy, although obviously China loomed large in the background. If we had pulled that off, China would have had to face one of two realities. Either they could go it alone and continue their own practices, or they could join the order that we had created. And I think that's what we're trying to do in the geopolitical strategic framework. Can we bring this transatlantic, trans-Pacific partnership of developed democracies together to set the rules of trade, the rules of the road? And then it's not a given how China responds to that. Do they stay the course, in which case I do think they become more isolated, or do they say, hey, let's walk this back and join the 21st century?
Thank you. Look, this kind of clearing of the air is exactly why we need more of these discussions, transatlantic discussions between leaders like you all, in whether it's revitalizing forums that have, fell into disuse in the Trump years, or whether it's creating new ones. But look, both of you guys, our American leaders, have stressed the security challenges and the need for cooperation and sort of a balancing strategy, a power balancing strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So let me go back to Reinhard and just ask, is it time for a NATO China Council and NATO a China Council, just as NATO created a Russia Council after 1989 and the end of the fall of the Soviet Union. And how worried are Europeans about being dragged into a kind of confrontation by the United States, most likely over Taiwan, I assume, in the South China Sea, East China Sea. So, you know, is there deep apprehension there? And I should say, add in fairness, you know, we have Joe Biden in office now, but who knows, you know, who might succeed him in recent history. But give us your views on the prospects for security collaboration in the Pacific.
Well, first of all, I'm happy that finally NATO, as Gerry just said a while ago, NATO has started looking at China and acknowledging that even though China is not an Atlantic power, it influences security also. In the treaty, the region that the treaty covers. On the other side, NATO has no business in the Indo-Pacific, and President Macron, in his reaction to some journalists' questions after the G7, frankly said so. We're not a Pacific organization. That does not mean that we have nothing to do with the security concerns. And I think it's a positive that increasingly European nations are sailing some of their ships through the South China Sea, maybe also through the Taiwan Straits, even though everybody understands that militarily that doesn't change the balance one iota. It has a symbolic value. It creates an important signal that where we stand. But the security contribution that European nations can really make is in securing Europe and its wider neighborhood. So letting the wall in the West get ruined in order to build a wall in the East would not be a good strategy. So let's defend and let's stabilize the wall in the West in order to be able to deal with the challenges elsewhere. But it is a fact also that the European Union is increasingly looking at the Indo-Pacific. France first, then Germany, then the Netherlands, and now the European Union have been coming up with Indo-Pacific strategies. And we're getting more and more involved. And as I said before, look at the electoral platforms of German political parties. 3 of the 4 parties that are the main contenders do address the issue of Taiwan in their platforms. That wouldn't have been the case 4 years ago. So there is a new attention being paid to the region. There is a certain language that is being used to deter Europeans from getting involved there. And that is used from some people around Europe, but also and primarily from Chinese sources. They say, oh, the Americans want to drag you, European, into their conflict with China. You have no business there. And whenever I voice a strong criticism of China, Chinese interlocutors will tell me, oh, you're now representing an American point of view. If you would be a true European, you would stay away from these issues. I completely disagree with that. This is not just a hegemonic battle between 2 superpowers. This is, as we said in the beginning, also a very systemic battle about whether democracy will prevail or authoritarianism. And there we belong to the same camp as the US and Canada and Australia and many other countries. So no, we don't want to be dragged into a confrontation, but we are not allowing others to tell us that we have no business in standing up to China. This is where Europe may not be very clear. And I would agree with Gerry that some of us have been slow. But when you look at the European Parliament as one political actor, we have a huge consensus, which is almost as good or maybe even just as good as in the Congress. The resolutions on China, on the Uyghurs, on Hong Kong, on the sanctions that we're adopting are adopted with 580 votes against 30. So there's a strong consensus from the conservatives, the center right, the center left, the liberals, the Greens. And I think that's the trajectory that is shaping up as the dominant development. And so I would say the false alternative that we're being offered by the Chinese and by some of the critics of the kind of position that I take would be that we should have an equidistance, that we should be somehow neutralized. We should mind our own business and not mingle with world affairs. I disagree.
That's great, great to hear.
I'd like to touch on something that Reinhard said that I think is incredibly important. The Chinese are going to say, hey, this is the United States versus China. Don't get involved in this. And that's a false equivalent. They're going to try to go to countries like Germany and Korea and others and say, hey, wait a minute, America is pushing you into this. That isn't this competition at all. As Reinhard accurately pointed out, this is about our values of democracy, our values of the rules of the road, of human rights, of free markets. And it is not the United States or China. It's a competition of values and what we actually believe as people.
If I could, first of all, the issue of whether NATO, for example, gets involved in China and issues related to China can no longer be one of geography. We don't live in that kind of world anymore. The malign cyber activity transcends geographical borders or regions, and the Chinese are every bit as adept at it as the Russians, and it's every bit as much of a threat from China as it is from Russia. But even beyond that, China is breaking down those geographic barriers all the time. They are very active in the Arctic, which last time I checked is a NATO sphere of influence, or we thought it was. So I mean, those old monoliths, have to be reexamined. And I agree with Reinhard. We can't let the Chinese decide for us what our boundaries are. And I just end on this point. I think what this dialogue represents, and I think what Reinhard was describing at the EU and what we're certainly doing at NATO, I think we're looking for a new equilibrium, moving from one that's more passive and reactionary with respect to China to one that's a lot more proactive and assertive. And I don't think that's a bad thing. We don't know what that equilibrium is going to be. For some Europeans, it's going to be different than it is for North Americans. And that's okay, because that's why we have the alliance. But we are moving, I think, to a more assertive, proactive equilibrium. And I think we're in the process of, helping to define that. And I think I agree with Ami that President Biden, in his visits both to G7 and to NATO and with the EU, I think helped move that discussion and provide clarity for that as we progress.
Well, we have so much to say and so little time to say it. And I'm told we're running toward the end of the show, which is too bad because this is fascinating. But I do want to try to get one more topic on the table if I could. And that is turning to an area where we need more cooperation with China. A lot of what I've heard is we've got to get stronger. We've got to become more united. We have to raise our game economically, in military terms, politically, vis-a-vis China. But we do need China's help on climate. China's the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, emits more, 2.5 times as much as the United States, and more than all the developed world combined. we can't reach any of these ambitious Paris Accords or goals, or Biden's goal of net zero global emissions by 2050 if China doesn't change the course it's on. We just saw a letter, 40 left-leaning groups in the United States sent a letter to you guys in Congress saying, let's not get into a confrontation with China on, presumably on human rights. They didn't say that, but let's not get into a confrontation with China, because we need to give top priority to climate change cooperation with China. Just give me, let me start with you, Gerry and Ami first. Please give me your reactions to that letter and to that argument. But how do we get China to the table and cooperative,
let me just say
while doing everything we talked about previously?
Yeah, my reaction to that letter without having seen the letter, so only how you've described it, I just think it's a false dichotomy. I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think we can be competitive with and even confrontational with China if we need to be, but that doesn't preclude cooperation in other areas. Witness our relationship longstanding with Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union. We can actually do both, and we need to. So I'd have, climate change, I think is one area of absolute cooperation. Obviously there are lots of areas of economic cooperation that need to be examined and re-examined in terms of overdependence. But I do think there are still lots of opportunities for economic cooperation as we move forward. And hopefully that's how it evolves so that we don't get into conflict. But certainly, listen, it's in China's interest to cooperate on issues like proliferation, climate change, trade and investment rules in terms of the global economy and the like. And so I think we should exploit common ground wherever we can. And certainly that's something we hear from our European allies as well. They want to do that. And I think they're right in that respect. And we ought to be supportive and looking for ways to do that, while at the same time, as I said, being very clear-eyed and very coherent and cogent on where we disagree and where we're certainly going to protect our interests.
I would just say I agree with everything that Gerry just said. And, while I agree with the premise of the letter that China needs to address climate change, the tactic of saying, well, let's go soft on China, China will exploit that. We have to address this from a place of strength, and just getting China to do what everyone else is already trying to do. That, again, we've got to push China in that direction, but do it from a place of strength, not a place of weakness.
On that point, and on Gerry's point of economic cooperation in addition to climate cooperation, just very quickly, is there any renewed interest in America getting into TPP as part of a stronger China policy?
I think.
I'm sorry, Gerry. I'm not. Gerry, I think you were talking, but. Yeah.
I think there
Please,
is.
Tommy, go ahead.
I think there is interest. As much as I'd love for us to get into CPTPP, maybe that's a bridge too far at this point. But could we do a digital trade deal? Could we start to piece some of this framework together and work towards a multilateral code? I think there is interest, certainly from some members of Congress. Perhaps we start with the digital trade realm. But again, I wouldn't give up on CPTPP. Again, I would look at USMCA, and you had 193 Democrats vote for that deal. You had 192 Republicans. So while it may not be easy, I think there's still an opportunity to do something.
Thanks, Gerry. Were you saying something? I think you might have been.
I was actually trying to pursue the letter question you were asking, and just because I do feel very strongly that, and I don't want to prejudge it because I haven't got the text in front of me, but if somebody's presenting this as, you've got this dichotomy and you need to choose the environment over everything else in the relationship because it is uber alles, I just think that is completely false and ought to be rejected. That's not a policy, and it undermines everything else we're trying to do. We've shot ourselves in the foot in the last 4 years by getting out of JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement. And we're desperately now trying to revive it. The only, no one benefited from that other than the hardliners in Tehran. We shot ourselves in the foot, and Ami and I were two lonely Democrats who supported the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but that would have undergirded 40% of all world trade. It would have made sure that we operated by Western commercial codes and rules of engagement with respect to the environment and human rights and labor law. And we walked away from it. And the only people who benefited from that were the Chinese in Beijing. And so we've done some really self-defeating things that must cause our European allies to still scratch their heads. We've got some catch up to do. But we can't simply say one set of issues are so important that we have to be prepared to sacrifice all others at that altar. I don't buy into that proposition at all. In fact, I flatly reject it.
Huge missed opportunity in trade and TPP, but we are about out of time. So the last word to Reinhard. And Reinhard, talk about this tension. You represent the German Greens. Is this a serious argument in Europe that if we get into a confrontation with China, then we may lose their cooperation on climate change and Paris, making the Paris Accords work? Your reflections on that, please, and any final word on what you would like to hear from the Biden administration on this topic, please, and then we'll have to end.
Well, I don't believe for a second that China will reduce 1 ton of CO2 more because we shut up and don't criticize their atrocious track record with regard to human rights. It's just not real. There are a lot of people who say China is an indispensable partner for climate policy. And I would say, yes, indispensable indeed, but are they really a partner? When you look at the 14th five-year plan, you don't see much of a partnership there. You don't see much of ambition there. And we should not mistake our hope for the reality. I would hope that they would partner with us, but I have seen that when Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord, then the Chinese started wavering and saying, well, maybe we will postpone. And when other countries upped their game, and when Biden came back and reiterated the pledge for the U.S. that the U.S. would team up with others, then Xi Jinping responded to that in his speech at the United Nations General Assembly, even though the speech per se is not a guarantee for anything. So I think we should try to find opportunities for partnership. I would also assume that there will be competition over some of these issues with China, but we have to walk on 2 feet. We cannot sacrifice human rights and values on the altar of a vague promise that China will act on climate just because we stop criticizing them. That would be playing their game. That's not our game. And what I would hope from the Biden administration is that they would put a lot of more flesh on the bones of the promise from USTR Catherine Tai that they want to turn trade into a tool for green transformation of our economies. Greening trade should be a priority for transatlantic partners.
I just want to say to my friend Reinhard, genau.
Well, it's great to be able to end on a note of vehement agreement. So thank you all very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It's been a really lively and fascinating conversation, and I think an important one. So deep thanks to Reinhard Bütikofer, to Gerry Connolly and Ami Bera for this meeting of important political leaders from Europe and the United States on this question of how we conduct this competition with China over this decade and beyond. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for devoting the time to it, and to be continued.
Thank you.